How you doing? I'm Tim Cocker with the latest Radio Academy podcast, and here I make it my mission to reveal things within our radio and audio industry, bringing you the stories, the ideas and the people that are shaping it. And quite often I like to be on top of what's happening right now. However, sometimes you've just got to let the dust settle a little bit. And it's now been a full 3 months since Ken Bruce began the next chapter of his storied radio career, leaving Radio 2 after 31 years at the network and 45 in total at the BBC.
And in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. And I have loved being here with you. Thanks so much, and may we meet again somewhere.
At the time, the single most listened to radio show in Europe, so a huge get for Bauer Media's Greatest Hits Radio, which is the somewhere that Ken referred to, hoping to meet again. So, after 3 months, which is, after all, a full quarter's worth of radar surveys, now that dust has settled, I thought it'd be a good time to reflect on the shift in the radio landscape following the move, and just check in on how it's going so far with Gary Stein, Bauer's Group Programme Director, who helped deliver the coup of getting Ken. And I started by taking Gary back, or asking him to take us back, to the moment that he was able to finally share the news with his team.
It was incredible because that was the day when we announced to most people that Ken had just announced on air that he was leaving Radio 2. So I remember sitting, listening to his final link at 5 to 12 that day.
I've made so many friends. I've worked with many wonderful colleagues. But I feel that after 45 years, as it's been, of full-time broadcasting on BBC Radio of some sort or another, it is time for a change.
The email was written, my finger was over the send button, and literally as soon as he finished his link,
have come up, and I would like to continue my career in just a slightly different way, if that is possible, in the next few years. We'll be revealing the details of those opportunities in a little while. But
we hit send, and you could just hear you could actually sense the reaction from everybody. Like, oh wow, that's big.
I would like to thank absolutely everybody who's helped to make the mid-morning show the success it is, and in particular, of course, you, the wonderful Radio 2 listener. Couldn't do it without you.
So yeah, pretty game-changing moment, really, and a moment in time. I think, a lot had led up to that, which I'm sure we'll talk about, but a moment in time that I think it will be very hard to make happen again, just in terms of what the reaction was that we saw, because obviously, we've never seen anything like it in terms of PR, an immediate audience impact, whether that be streaming or whether that be social engagement or, all the metrics, all the important metrics, just from that moment, actually from that day, just started moving up very quickly.
And on a personal level and a professional level, again, just lingering on that moment for a little bit longer, and obviously the work that I'm sure went on to make that happen, from your point of view, Gary.
Yeah, it had been, we'd been living with the secret, and we had a special kind of code name inside the business for one or two people that knew about it, and the code words were Special K. And so we've been talking about, we'd been keeping this a secret for probably the best part of, some people, for the best part of 9 months. So and living with it for that long, and the thought that at any time it might just leak, or it could just come out, and it might not be on sort of our terms and our timeline, it was quite a relief, to be honest, that day when the news was out there, and it had all gone the way we'd, I suppose, hoped it would go, in terms of being able to announce it to the business, rather than somebody leaking something and somebody reading something elsewhere.
Just from my personal point of view, Gary, I think one of the measures of how big a moment this was, and I think moment, as you've used, is the right word, is that on air on Virgin Radio, we have been openly saying, if you've had a change of habit at 10 o'clock, come and give us a go. There's the acknowledgement that this is a seismic change, that is the fabric of radio in the UK shifted in that moment.
Yeah, I think the amazing thing about this as a moment in time as well was, we obviously had started to think about, the building this brand many years before. But with the BBC moving their strategy and a gap opening up, I think that this is a rare opportunity to pull people across who are not listeners necessarily to commercial radio into the commercial radio world. And I think that can only be a good thing for, as you've acknowledged with how you sort of spoke to your listeners on Virgin, that can only be a good thing for commercial radio, full stop, that this has happened. Because these, I think from what I've seen in terms of a lot of the correspondence we've had into the station and some of the other things we're seeing, these are not necessarily, a lot of people are coming across who were not listening to commercial radio before, which I think is really encouraging for us as an industry.
With me now, Noel Gallagher. Hello.
Hello.
Lovely to see you.
You too? So this is where you're hiding, is it?
Yeah, I've been chased out of several places, and I've found a nice little...
I was at your old stomping ground the other day, and I thought to myself, the charisma levels in this place have plummeted downwards.
Yeah,
I was like, the big man has left. And I was like, really?
He has to go sooner or later, hasn't he?
It was inevitable.
Yeah.
But it's nice to see you here anyway.
It's lovely to have you with us in these new environments.
Thank you very much.
And you just used the word strategy then. I'd love to pick your brains on, as far as you can say, and as far as you're willing to say, but on the bigger strategic picture and how this fits in. Yeah,
I mean, I suppose the timeline on this goes back to, 2015 really, because 2015 was the time when, if you remember, the original AM stations for the Bauer network were magic at that time. And they changed to what became known as BC2, the Big City 2 network. And that was where they all changed to your City 2s and your Hallam 2s and everything else. And I think the interesting thing about this was they were only on AM, but that, I suppose, was the moment the classic hits format was really kind of born for this network. And at that time, everybody was talking about it as it's a bit of a sleeping giant. It's kind of radio's best kept secret. We had a lot of people saying how much they loved it, but there wasn't that many people, in the grand scheme of things, listening to these stations because of distribution and a variety of other factors. So we, I suppose, at that time, clocked this really big opportunity for this format, for this kind of classic hits format, to become pretty big in terms of the UK, and it is in many parts of the world, because when you think about the music, the radio set at that time, there's a lot of mood stations, there's a lot of era stations popping up on digital, but there wasn't really a kind of full-rounded classic hit station, that was centred in the decades where a lot of commercial radio listeners grew up and listened and formed their habits. And December 2015 was a really kind of big one, because that was the moment that Radio City 2 went onto FM in Liverpool. And the audience numbers shot up pretty quickly. And I think that internally everybody's looking at going, this has got more potential in terms of a format. So I suppose over the next 3 or 4 years, there was a lot of discussions, and we really started to think about what could a rebrand of this network look like, and what sort of talent should we have. And I suppose that's what led to the signing of Mark Goodyear, who was one of the first presenters on the network in terms of national names. Andy Crane was already there. Rossi was on Breakfast at that point and is still on Breakfast. Just before the rebrand, we signed Paul Gambaccini and Jenny Powell, and the names started to sort of, the building blocks started to form. Des Paul at the weekends, and we started thinking about BBC moving their strategy, that gap opening up. Let's create the commercial version of Radio 2, right? Which in the past I think has always been, it's in the too difficult box, and it'll probably never work, because really hard to get an audience. And we've all seen it in commercial radio focus groups in the past. The reason people don't like listening to commercial radio is, well, it's got the ads and I'm going to stick with the BBC. But things were changing. We felt things were changing. So January 2019, the switch was flicked, and BC2 became Greatest Hits Radio. So that was a big moment on the timeline. Absolute, on the back of what had happened in Liverpool, Absolute was changed in the West Midlands to become a digital-only station. And for greatest hits, it took the FM in the West Midlands. And then the same year, Andy Ashton, who is the network content director, had a relationship with Mick Rock and managed to secure image rights for some incredible imagery, which, we put on the marketing in terms of that year. So he secured that, and that gave the station a real kind of very strong identity. Actually, I think that was quite a big moment as well. And then the next year, there was this momentum now, and the next year obviously we were into the pandemic at this point. So COVID had hit, everybody was kind of working from home, and we had just bought all these radio stations, so the wireless stations, the UKRD stations, and the Celador stations, and they were all, during lockdown, rebranded, integrated and rebranded to greatest hits. That I think was the big bang moment, because suddenly you had all this distribution all over the country, and alongside that, a multi-million-pound marketing campaign with an ad that was a joy to create, but had been created in lockdown, and there'd been so many sort of meetings about the creative direction, and we were all really clear by this point of what the station was going to be. So that was kind of the distribution piece and the early part of the talent. And then what came after that was March 2021, and Simon Mayo was already doing an album show at the weekend on a Sunday, and he joined the station to do Drive. And this was again such a big moment, because it felt like the station was now a real commercial competitor to Radio 2. Simon was doing the show that listeners loved him for, I think, first and foremost, that he'd been doing on Radio 2. All Request Friday was on there. Confessions was on there. Matt was on Sport. And Simon joining was, I think, the final building block that led to what was to come earlier this year. And the momentum really continued after that, because we then flipped Absolute London to greatest hits, and Absolute continued on DAB. And the strategy around that was really simple. We will have a bigger audience by changing the distribution. And I suppose it's no different to when you think about AM and FM back in the day and how all of that changed. Very, very similar. It's just a kind of repeat with DAB and FM. And what do you know, over 1 million in London on FM. So these were some of the important things, I think, in terms of that timeline leading up to that moment.
The impact you already touched on was immediate. The very announcement of a name coming led to I'm assuming that had a part to play with Q1 Radar bump. And yeah. I mean, what's the anticipation and expectation like for next month?
So yeah, I mean, well, I said we saw it on the metrics, right? Because the streaming, I think the streaming kind of moved up in 3 waves. I think the first wave was the announcement. I think the second big jump up was the first Monday without Ken on Radio 2, and then the third big jump up was when Ken started on the station on the 3rd of April. And yeah, you're right. I mean, we added 1 million listeners there in that quarter. That quarter didn't have Ken on air in terms of mid mornings. So yeah, I mean, you in terms of how you hope it's going to go this year, I hope pretty well, given what we've seen so far. But I think that just shows you, doesn't it, the power of all that PR. And I have to say that in terms of that moment in time and all the socials and everything else, the team were absolutely incredible, Tim. I mean, whether it's Andy Ashton, who's the network content director, David Saul, James Walker, who looks after the operations, Charlotte Greenham on the social team, or Beth McDonald, who looks after PR. They were all in that inner circle, over the last few months before the announcement. So they were all kind of in the know and had put together an incredible plan. We brought Ken in for a day of secret filming, which was in London, and it was only the week before the announcement, actually. So it was so close to the announcement, and I just can't speak highly enough of that team, who actually turned all that content around in the space of a few days and just made it look like that big bang moment. And I've no doubt that was a big part of the PR momentum that we got in that quarter, was the fact that everything was ready to go. And it's so rare that you're in that situation with these sort of things.
And I've no doubt as well, you've talked about your listeners, your programming team. I've no doubt your commercial team were absolutely buzzing. I know from colleagues of mine in Chris Evans and Graham Norton, suddenly people that weren't accessible to commercial clients suddenly are, and you've got a prime bit of real estate there, haven't you?
You'd hope so, and I think any client, we've been saying this, any client who comes on board now really is getting such a great deal, because we've seen it. Radar's probably not there yet in terms of the numbers, because we haven't had a quarter with Ken on, and even then you've got many stations on 6 months and 12-month books, so you've always got a bit of a lag. So yeah, I mean, from a commercial point of view, we've had some good success stories since the arrival of Ken, and I think the listener piece as well. I've never seen, how hard it is these days to get emails and letters into a radio station. It just doesn't happen very often, unless they want to complain about something, right? Which obviously is not what we want to hear. But we've had unprompted just so much correspondence from listeners, and I think one of my favourites was, I've got plenty of favourites. I've kept a little file. But one of my favourites was, and I'm sorry, anybody listening from the BBC when I read this one out, but great news about Ken Bruce. I've never heard of Greatest Hits, but we'll be listening from April. I only paid the BBC fee because of Ken Bruce. Was the only output I actually watched, listened to, so we'll be saving on that as well. Signed, Andrew Atkins.
Wow. And I've also got to ask, I don't know whether... I don't know the story behind this, but I can only think the acumen and intelligence of Ken to retain intellectual property of Popmaster as well, which is now a TV show too.
When we started talking, I was really surprised that Ken owned Popmaster, which was like it's the icing on the cake, really, because that's the moment, isn't it, that the country stops for. And is the most talked about feature on what was the biggest radio show in Europe, I think, that he had on Radio 2 at the time. So yeah, he registered that many years ago, and he owns the IP, and he's looking to sort of expand that in different ways. And obviously the TV show launched a few weeks ago on More 4, and I think that's gone really well. So yeah, it's such a great brand though, isn't it? It's such a well-known, famous brand, and a quiz that will work so well in many different formats, and in the past it's always just been on radio.
Yes, it's Popmaster back with us again. Oh, we've missed it. I have anyway. And I've no doubt our first contestant has as well. First contestant today, brand new on Greatest Hits Radio, is Laura Weir, who's in Oxfordshire. Good morning, Laura.
Good morning, Ken. I'm very happy to be here with you today.
Well, it's a delight to have you with us this morning, Laura. You've made history. You're the very first Popmaster contestant on Greatest Hits Radio. But don't worry, there's no pressure. No pressure whatsoever.
Obviously, you're in a position where you're looking across the whole operation, but from where you sit, how has Ken assimilated in at Bauer and with his team around him?
If you know Ken, he is the most easygoing, laid-back broadcaster, and he's the nicest guy in the world. And I think the most amazing quality he has is going in and making radio sound easy. And we know it's not, but he makes radio sound so effortless and easy every single day. And I think he's really enjoying working at the station up until this point. The team love him. It feels like he's been there forever. That's the only way I can describe it to him. It doesn't feel, even from day one, it didn't feel like for him his life had been turned upside down or this was a huge change. He was just coming in and doing what he'd always done in the way he'd always done it.
And what's the roadmap here, Gary? What's your vision when you look out into the distance? You said it's been 5-6 years getting things to this point with Greatest Hits Radio. What do things look like in another 5 years?
So I think there's a couple of things we're working on at the moment. Obviously, we launched Premium, which was the first UK radio to launch a premium service for listeners. I think Greatest Hits is doing really well there, and I think the reason it's doing well is because you have got those listeners coming across from non-commercial backgrounds. In terms of we've got this service on many stations across Europe and in the UK, and Greatest Hits is by far the biggest. And we've got channels like the 70s, 80s and Simon's album channel doing really well. So I think we want to build that offer out and do more with that over the coming months. I think obviously we've got a new app launching later this year, Rayo, and I think that's going to be a really interesting opportunity for us, because what it will do is it will, Bauer's obviously got super strong brands, but when they're all together in one place, working together and being able to sort of amplify some of that content. So I think opening up the door, Ken's already getting some great guests in, like Noel Gallagher and Elton John, etc. But we want to really do more of that, I think, and I think that also is what the Greatest Hits listeners want to hear and expect, especially the new listeners to the station. And then I suppose the other area is just the specials, and doing more there. So we had Ken back to the start for the NHS 75th anniversary, and I don't know if you sort of saw any of that, but that was a lovely piece in kind of in hospital radio, and that was, I think, it's the type of content that commercials not done much of in the past, but that's proving a big hit. Also on the red carpet for the Ziggy Stardust premiere. So things like that I think are really interesting, and I think we want to make this brand, we want depth in terms of, we certainly want depth and lots of content in terms of this brand around the edges, which I think is going to be important. So yeah, I think now though, I think it's about probably consolidating. We've made some pretty seismic changes, and I think it's now about just letting this settle down for a while, and making sure the music and the shows are rolling out brilliantly. And I think that's what the team are really focused on.
Yeah, moves like this really don't happen very often, do they? So how interesting to get that firsthand and as close as you can get insight into the inner workings of that deal and its impact on Greatest Hits Radio, on Bauer Media and on radio more broadly. So thanks again to Gary Stein for his time and his candour. Really enjoyed that. A reminder, go to radioacademy.org, where for as little as £3 per month you can become a member, get instant access to all of the content on the website and find out about our networking events which are happening at the end of this month, Summer Social in Yorkshire and a last Monday event in London as well. And while you're there, you can nominate yourself or someone else for this year's 30 Under 30.